Act 1. The House That Didn't Flee October, 1879. Dakota Territory. The wind did not arrive suddenly. It crept. It slid low across the prairie, whispering through dry grass, carrying with it a promise every frontier family understood without being told. Winter was coming early, and it would not forgive mistakes. By the first week of October, homesteaders along the valley were already rushing. Logs were stacked. Chinking rushed into gaps. Firewood piles grew higher by the day. Every man knew the rule: build fast, build light, keep the heat above ground, and pray your walls were tight enough to last until spring. Everyone followed that rule. Everyone, except one. On a patch of hard-packed earth near the creek bend, a solitary figure worked alone. While his neighbors raised walls, he dug downward. While others lifted logs, he disappeared into the ground itself. His name was Elias Korvin. From a distance, his project looked less like a home and more like a grave. The pit was wide, uncomfortably deep. Stone after stone vanished into the earth, stacked with care that seemed wildly out of place for a frontier cabin meant to be finished before snowfall. Men passing by slowed their wagons. Some laughed. Others shook their heads. "He's burying himself," one said. Another spat into the dirt. "That hole will freeze solid by December." But Elias did not argue. He did not explain. He did not hurry. He measured. He listened. He waited. By late October, when the first hard frost snapped the prairie grass underfoot, something strange became clear. Elias Korvin was not building on the land. He was building into it. And when winter finally struck, when blizzards locked families indoors and entire homesteads were abandoned, only one house in the valley remained occupied from the first storm to the last thaw. It was not the warmest house, it was the most stable. And stability, that winter, meant survival. Act 2. The decision they called suicide. Elias Korvin arrived in the territory 2 years earlier, with little more than a handcart, a battered notebook, and tools most men no longer bothered to carry. Stone tools. He was not a talker. He did not drink much. He did not boast. And that, more than anything, unsettled people. Frontier communities trusted men who spoke loudly about what they knew. Elias did not. He worked with a quiet precision that suggested he was answering questions no one else had thought to ask. When he finally claimed his parcel, 160 acres of wind-exposed prairie, the reaction was polite, but skeptical. The land sat low. The soil was dense. Spring floods ran close. Most settlers would have chosen higher ground. Elias chose depth. The first shock came when he marked his foundation. Instead of the shallow trench common to the valley, barely enough to anchor a log wall, Elias staked out a pit nearly 6 feet deep and far wider than the footprint of his planned cabin. "Korvin," said Thomas Hale, a carpenter who had built more than a dozen cabins in the territory, "you don't need that much depth. You're wasting time. Winter doesn't wait." Elias nodded and kept digging. By mid-October, wagons loaded with stone began arriving. River stone, dense sedimentary slabs, pieces most builders avoided because they were heavy, awkward, and slow to work with. Men gathered. "What are you building?" Hale asked again. "A house," Elias replied. "That's not a foundation," another man scoffed. "That's a burial pit." The name stuck. The grave house. As the pit filled with stone, rumors grew darker. Some claimed Elias didn't understand prairie frost. Others said he'd brought foreign ideas that didn't belong on open land. A few whispered that he had lost family to winter elsewhere and was overcompensating, trying to build something that could not fail because he could not bear to. What troubled them most was not the stone. It was where he put it. Instead of insulating upward, Elias layered downward. Stone met earth. Earth wrapped stone. And above it all, he planned a modest structure, smaller than most cabins, lighter than expected. "Stone pulls cold," Hale insisted one afternoon. "Everyone knows that. You're building a cold sink under your own floor." Elias paused, wiped dirt from his hands, and looked at the ground. "Cold doesn't sink," he said quietly. "It moves."
He knows anything about it.
That answer satisfied no one. By the end of October, laughter had hardened into judgment. At the general store, men shook their heads over supplies. "He'll burn twice the wood and still freeze. Digging like that will trap damp air. He's fighting the land instead of working with it." Elias heard every word. He did not respond. Because he was not fighting the land. He was listening to it. In his notebook, never shown to anyone, Elias wrote the same sentence again and again, adjusting the phrasing each time. Heat does not disappear. It is only delayed. While others built walls to block winter, Elias was building a system to slow it. He called it something no one else ever heard him say, aloud. The ground lung, a place where heat could breathe, where warmth could settle, where time itself would stretch long enough to matter. When the first snow finally fell, covering the prairie in a thin, deceptive calm, the grave house stood half-buried and unfinished. Men said Elias had waited too long. They said winter would teach him the cost of stubbornness. What they did not realize was that winter was exactly what Elias had been preparing for. And soon, in Act 3. The thing they couldn't see by early November, Elias Korvin's structure finally began to resemble something recognizable as a home. From the outside, it looked unimpressive. A single-room cabin, low walls, a roof pitched just steep enough to shed snow. No grand hearth, no towering chimney, nothing that suggested innovation or danger. But what the valley could not see was what lay beneath. While other cabins rested lightly on shallow footings, Elias's house sat atop a layered system of stone, soil, and air that extended deep into the ground. Not a cellar, not a basement. Something older, something rarely named. The pit beneath the cabin floor was sealed, not open. Flat stone lined the base, fitted tightly, creating a surface that absorbed heat rather than leaking it away. The walls were thick, uneven by design, forcing warmth to move slowly, reluctantly, through mass instead of rushing into the cold. There was no exposed earth inside the space. Moisture had nowhere to rise. Cold had no direct path upward. This was not insulation. It was inertia. Elias never used technical terms when anyone pressed him. He spoke in plain language, the way knowledge had always been passed between builders who learned by watching structures fail. "Cold moves fast," he told one curious passerby. "Stone moves slow." That slowness was the point. The hearth sat higher than expected, its base anchored directly into the stone mass below. When a fire burned, heat did not simply rise and escape. It pressed downward first, soaking into the floor, into the walls beneath the living space. No vents, no pipes, no clever mechanisms, just gravity, mass, time. When asked why he had gone to such trouble, Elias gave the same answer each time. "I'm not trying to make the house warm," he said. "I'm trying to keep it from becoming dangerous." That distinction mattered more than anyone realized. Most frontier cabins followed the same pattern. When the fire burned hot, the space near the hearth was tolerable. Step too far away, and the cold crept back in. At night, when flames died, temperatures dropped quickly. sometimes fatally so. Elias had designed his house around a different question entirely. What happens after the fire goes out? The answer, he believed, was buried under their feet. As November darkened and daylight shortened, Elias tested his system constantly. He burned small fires, let them die, measured the floor with his hand, returned hours later to do it again. He watched how heat spread, how it lingered, how it faded. The house responded slowly, like a living thing adjusting to weather rather than resisting it. Still, the valley remained unconvinced. Stone, they said, was cold, and winter was coming to prove it. Act 4. When winter didn't knock, the storm arrived without warning. Not the kind that announces itself with falling snow and gentle accumulation, but the kind that steals warmth before anyone realizes it has begun. The wind rose first. It swept across the open land in long, uninterrupted gusts, carrying fine ice that worked its way into seams, cracks, and lungs. Snow followed, not heavy, but constant, day after day, night after night. For 11 straight days, the sun did not matter. Inside the valley, cabins began to fail, not structurally, but functionally. Firewood burned faster than planned. Logs that had seemed dry smoked and sputtered, their heat output weak and unreliable. Chimneys clogged. Drafts reversed direction under pressure from the wind. Men slept in shifts, feeding fires every 2 hours. Families crowded into the warmest corners of single rooms, abandoning beds near outer walls. Sleep became fragmented. Tempers shortened. Judgment suffered. The cold did not kill with drama. It wore people down. By the 4th night, one man collapsed while chopping wood, his hands too numb to hold the axe properly. Another burned his palm badly, while tending a fire he could no longer feel. By the 6th day, 2 families packed what they could and left their homes entirely, seeking shelter closer to town, where iron stoves burned day and night. The storm showed no sign of ending, and through it all, Elias Korvin did something no one else dared. He let his fire die at night. Neighbors noticed the absence of smoke rising from his chimney long before they believed the reason. "That's madness," Thomas Hale muttered, watching from a distance. "He'll wake up frozen." But Elias slept. Inside the grave house, the air never became warm, but it never collapsed into danger either. The temperature shifted slowly, reluctantly, as if the house itself resisted sudden change. The floor remained cool to the touch, but not biting. The walls did not radiate cold. There was no sharp edge to the air that burned the lungs. While others fought winter hour by hour, Elias endured it by stretching time. On the 8th day of the storm, a man named Samuel Wright knocked at Elias's door. Wright's hands shook violently. His beard was rimmed with ice. He had not slept more than an hour at a time in nearly a week. "I need somewhere stable," he said plainly. "Just for the night." Elias stepped aside. Inside, Wright expected heat. He found something else. Stillness. The temperature did not spike near the hearth. It did not fall away toward the walls. It simply existed, unchanging, indifferent to the chaos outside. Wright stood in silence for a long moment. "This isn't warm," he said finally. "No," Elias replied, "but it won't kill you." That night, the fire burned low. Then, not at all, and the house did not betray them. By morning, Wright realized something unsettling. For the first time since the storm began, he had slept through the night without waking. No alarms, no panic, no desperate need to tend flame. Outside, the wind continued its assault. Inside, the ground lung did its work. quietly, invisibly, patiently. Winter had arrived expecting a fight. Instead, it was being slowed to a crawl. Act 5. The night the house refused to fail by the 10th day of the storm, the valley no longer argued about Elias Korvin's house. They worried about it. Smoke no longer rose from his chimney at night. Not the frantic, constant plume seen elsewhere. Just a faint trace during daylight hours. Sometimes nothing at all. Men began stopping at a distance, counting hours. No fire since dusk, someone whispered. That's suicide. But Elias did not die. On the 11th night, the cold reached its deepest point. Wind carved through the prairie at sustained speeds that stripped heat from skin in minutes. The temperature fell low enough that metal burned to the touch. Inside most cabins, the cold finally broke through discipline and planning. Fires roared, but could not keep pace. Walls radiated chill. Breath crystallized in the air. Several families abandoned their homes entirely that night. Elias Korvin did not add a single piece of wood after sunset. The hearth cooled, coals dimmed, ash settled, and the house held. At dawn, Thomas Hale arrived unannounced, driven less by curiosity than fear. He expected to find a frozen man, perhaps worse. Instead, Elias was seated at the small table, eating slowly, his movements unhurried. The cabin was not warm, but it was safe. Hale stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The sound of the wind vanished. The air did not bite. The walls did not steal breath. "How long since you fed the fire?" Hale asked quietly. 14 hours, Elias replied. Hale stared at the hearth. Cold ash. No flame. He placed his hand on the stone floor. It was cool, but not cold. Then he touched the wall near the base of the structure. Warm. Not the fleeting warmth of air, but the steady resistance of mass that had been charged long before. "This doesn't make sense," Hale said. "It does," Elias replied. "Just not the way we were taught." They began to measure. Not with instruments, with time. At 1 hour after sunrise, the temperature had dropped only slightly. 2 hours later, it held. By midday, the difference was negligible. In other cabins, the moment a fire died, temperatures collapsed sharply. 10 degrees lost in the first hour, sometimes more. Here, change came slowly, predictably, safely. The house did not spike or crash. It drifted. Elias traced a line in the air with his finger. "Heat isn't gone," he said. "It's delayed, stored, released when it matters most." Hale sank onto a stool. "For years," he said, "we've been fighting winter every hour." Elias nodded. "And losing sleep to it." Word spread quickly, not as rumor, but as fact. Men came not to mock, but to stand silently inside the grave house and feel what it meant when a structure refused to panic. By the end of that week, no one laughed anymore. Act 6. When the valley stopped arguing, the questions came carefully at first. Not shouted across fence lines. Not voiced in public. Quiet ones, asked by men who had spent decades trusting rules that had suddenly failed them. How deep? How much stone? What happens if the fire dies completely? Elias answered all of them, but never with formulas. "This isn't about heat," he told them. "It's about stability." He explained what winter really punished. Not cold nights, but sharp changes. Not low temperatures, but rapid loss. Not poor insulation, but panic built into design. "If a house needs you awake to survive," Elias said, "then the house has failed. Not the winter." That sentence moved through the valley faster than any measurement ever could. Men began to understand what had unsettled them all along. Elias hadn't built a warmer house. He had built a calmer one, a structure that absorbed stress instead of amplifying it. Slowly, plans changed. Some dug deeper on their next builds. Others added mass beneath existing floors. A few experimented cautiously, adding stone where wood alone had always been trusted. No one copied Elias exactly. They adapted. By the time the storm finally broke, something fundamental had shifted. The valley no longer measured success by how hot a hearth burned, but by how little it needed to. Sleep returned. So did confidence. Families stopped fearing the sound of wind at night. Children played farther from fires. Corners once abandoned became livable again. And Elias Korvin returned to anonymity. He did not teach classes. He did not name his method. He did not seek recognition. When asked what he had built, he gave the same answer he always had: a house that remembers. What the valley remembered instead was the winter itself. Act 7. What the ground remembered when spring finally came to the valley. It did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with exhaustion. Snow retreated slowly, revealing splintered firewood piles, collapsed sheds, and cabins whose walls bore the quiet scars of a winter fought hour by hour. Men counted what they had lost, not just in timber and time, but in sleep, in confidence, in the unspoken fear that had settled into every night. Elias Korvin counted nothing. His house stood unchanged. The stone beneath it had cooled gradually, returning its stored warmth to the earth the same way it had borrowed it months earlier. No cracks appeared, no warping, no rot where damp should have gathered. The ground lung exhaled its last breath of winter and went silent. That silence became its legacy. No plaque was mounted. No technique was formally named. There was no association, no manual, no blueprint preserved in ink. What spread instead was something harder to erase. Memory. Builders who visited Elias's house did not leave with measurements alone. They left with a different way of thinking about survival itself. They stopped asking how to make houses hotter. They began asking how to make them calmer. In the years that followed, cabins across the region began to change in small, almost unnoticeable ways. Foundations grew heavier. Floors thickened. Hearths moved inward. Firewood piles shrank. Winter did not become kinder. People became less desperate. Families slept through nights that once demanded vigilance. Children played where cold corners had ruled before. Men stopped waking in panic to check dying embers. The anxiety that winter had always carried, quiet, constant, corrosive, began to loosen its grip. Elias Korvin never took credit for any of it. When a territorial newspaper sent a young reporter to speak with him in the late 1880s, the man expected a story of innovation, of invention, of frontier genius. Elias disappointed him. "I didn't build anything new," he said. "I built something remembered." He spoke of builders who had never seen the prairie, of stone houses in cold valleys across the world, of cultures that survived not by overpowering winter, but by understanding how heat moved and how it lingered. "We keep thinking progress means adding," Elias said. "More fire, more effort, more fuel. Sometimes it means slowing down instead." The reporter asked him why such knowledge had been forgotten. Elias thought for a long time before answering. "Because it worked quietly," he said, "and quiet things are easy to ignore." By the time Elias died, his original house had already outlived dozens of others built the same year. When it was finally dismantled decades later to make way for modern development, Engineers examined the foundation out of curiosity. They found nothing extraordinary, just stone, earth, air, arranged with patience. The principles Elias had lived by would eventually be rediscovered under new names: thermal inertia, passive design, ground coupling, radiant stability. They would be patented, marketed, branded as innovations. What history forgot was that none of it had been invented. It had been remembered. The story of the grave house was never about stone. It was about resisting panic, about understanding that survival does not belong to those who fight hardest in every moment, but to those who design for the moments when they cannot fight at all. Winter tests systems, not when conditions are ideal, but when they fail. Elias Korvin built a house that did not demand heroics. It did not require constant attention. It did not punish rest. It absorbed stress. It slowed loss. It bought time. And time in the frontier was often the difference between life and death. Somewhere beneath modern roads and forgotten fields, the stone Elias placed still lies buried. It no longer warms a home, but it has not failed. It waits, because stone does not forget what it once held, and neither should we. If there is one lesson the grave house leaves behind, it is this: sometimes the strongest way to survive is not to push harder, but to remember what we once knew and build with patience again. The ground remembers. Make sure you do too.